All right. I think we're recording. Okay.
What says it on my end?
Perfect. All right, Ryan. Thank you so much for being here, man. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing great. Yeah, no, it's definitely a pleasure to have you on. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while. We've been following each other and exchanging a few messages back and forth on Instagram for a while. So it's good to get you in person here and be able to have a little conversation.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so you've had quite the extensive career in hockey. Spent a lot of time in the NHL. Have had vast experience in the people you've learned from coming up into the world of strength and conditioning. And I want to get into all that eventually here, but I want to start with kind of where you're at now. So you're at X Factory now. So just take us through what X Factory is, kind of what you guys do there, and kind of the population you're with there.
Yeah, I mean, so you're right. I'm the director of performance at X Factory and a partner here. And X Factory actually came into existence about 2.5 years ago. And it's under the umbrella of a bigger company called Village Sports. So Village Sports is a big sports company in Calgary, primarily dealing with youth sports and youth athletics. And underneath that umbrella, there's a few companies. And so one would be a Global Sports Academy, which is a sports academy that's based in some of the school systems in Calgary. So athletes will get school credit for doing sport-related work. There's Sticks Hockey. It's more of a hockey academy, hockey schools, hockey skills, on ice stuff. There's actually a golf academy called Forge Golf.
Nice.
And then prior to X Factory coming into existence, we're just basically outsourcing strength and conditioning to various other companies within Calgary. And they thought, well, I think we can do this ourselves. And I actually know one of the founders of the company who'd reached out to me at that point. And, I was still in the thick of my NHL career. And they reached out to me and asked if I was interested in kind of spearheading this whole X Factory division. And, at the time I was basically like, not really. I still feel like I have a couple, I had another year or two left on my contract with the Calgary Flames. But at the same time, I have two little kids, at the time, really little. Now they're 5 and 1, and
Right.
my 1-year-old's about to turn 2. And I'm like, I'm traveling full time with the Flames. It's really tough. And my wife's got a pretty demanding job as well. It's just tough being a good dad when you're away all the time. And it was kind of like,
Sure.
well, maybe this is my exit strategy. But in the meantime, I was like, I can certainly consult, help you build the gym, do all the programming for the company. And in the off season, I can potentially, work with a group or two outside of the Flame stuff, as long as it didn't conflict. And that's kind of how it evolved. And then, my contract at the end of last season was expiring, and I kind of made the decision to go all in on the X Factory side of things. And it's been great. So we primarily work with hockey players. We're not exclusive to hockey players, but I would say that's
Right.
probably 95% of our clientele. We range from U15 all the way to pro in the
Right.
off season. And then in season, we have, basically minor hockey teams coming through nightly, both male and female. So that's kind of how it evolved. And, like we're growing pretty well. Like we're growing at a decent clip, but like anything new, it's still a work in progress, and we're still
Right.
going through some of those growing pains and trying to figure all that stuff out. But so far, so good. It's been great.
Nice. Yeah. What initially, like, you've spent so much time in the world of hockey, and you say like now you're still primarily dealing with hockey players. Like, what drew you into hockey? Did you choose hockey, or did hockey training kind of choose you in a way?
I think it kind of chose me. I mean, I grew up playing hockey.
Yeah.
I played junior and then played university at Queen's University in Kingston for 4 years, and then played some semi-pro in Germany for a year, which was more about having fun than anything else.
Right.
So it was really the sport that I focused on growing up. I mean, I played other sports like lacrosse and soccer and things like that, but it was, my favorite sport. And training hockey players, especially in Canada and here, I mean, that's your primary clientele for the most part in terms of youth
Right.
athletics. But I think it kind of chose me, and to a degree, I chose it because it is, the sport I grew up playing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, you spent so much time in the NHL prior to this, right? So working with the elite of the elite, every player who I've ever trained and every hockey player who ever steps on the ice in Canada dreams of playing in the NHL, right? And so you spend so much time in that world in what we would consider elite high performance, transitioning into the private sector and now dealing with kind of the youth teams or the younger teams. Like what are the differences that you're noticing or the challenges you're kind of facing with that sort of training now?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at like the NHL level and all the athletes you would have in that organization, it is a fairly homogeneous group in terms of like their skill level, their how well they can train, their mindset. These guys are the best of the best at that level, and that's not
Yeah.
to say that everyone's exactly the same in terms of ability and mindset at that level, but I think that the bandwidth is pretty narrow in that
Yeah.
sense. Whereas in the private sector, yeah, sure, we do have some pro guys that play in the NHL that train here and all that stuff, and they would kind of fall in that category. But I would say the clientele is much more diverse. Obviously, we have young athletes that have never done any off ice training in their lives before,
Hmm.
all the way up to guys that have been training for 10 plus years. So that bandwidth is significantly better. So, I mean, the biggest thing I think for the younger athletes is, helping them understand the value of off ice training, kind of generating, a different mindset rather than, okay, well, uh, you know, my parents are making me do this. They need to
Right.
understand, I need to understand why this is important. And if I really want to get to the next level of hockey, this is something that I have to buy into fully. Um,
Right.
and obviously, like at those younger ages too, like the training is a little bit different. We have to really, and this goes the same for everybody, but for that age group, we really have to work on like fundamental aspects of that training. Whereas if you have a guy that's trained for 15 years, that looks significantly different.
Yeah. No, I wholeheartedly agree. It's funny because like I always find like even myself, I fell victim to this too. Like when I became a strength coach and started working with athletes, of course, like my number one thing if you had to ask me, I was like, I want to work with pro athletes. And then I get to work with pro athletes and you're like, well, they're not that much different than just a regular athlete. And in some ways, in a lot of ways, I think they're actually easier to work with than working with like youth athletes. Like I think
Oh,
to our best coaches in the field, I think should be working at those lower levels, right? And it's just so interesting that everyone wants to be at that higher level. And then you get there and it's like, it's less about like you preparing them and more about just like staying out of their way. They made it to the pros. They know, some of these guys you talk about like 10, 15 years in the league, like they know how to take care of their body. There's not much I'm going to do for them. Like it's just kind of at this point, stay out of their way and to help support them however you can. Right.
it's so true. I mean, I guess my goal is to get these athletes to the point where I'm coaching as little as possible.
Right.
And so they understand, you know, whatever I'm asking them without me saying anything in terms of movement, whatever, preparation and all that stuff. And with,
Yeah.
I get to with my pro groups, especially some of the guys have been training for years. You could come into that session as a young coach or an intern or something like that and be like, you're really, he's not really saying much to these guys. And that's actually the goal, is to not,
Right.
get them to that point. Whereas obviously with younger groups, it's way more hands-on. You have to be on them at all times in terms of what they're doing and all that kind of stuff. And you're 100% right. It is definitely harder coaching younger athletes than it is a seasoned vet that has years of good training under his belt or her belt.
Yeah. You mentioned there previously about with the younger athletes, it's mostly about like fostering that culture of like what training is, showing them the value of how this carries over to the ice, and just getting that buy-in. How do you kind of approach that with a younger athlete? Like, what do you think is the best way to get buy-in from an athlete or from a younger athlete, and to get them to see the value of what we're doing in the weight room is actually transitioning to the ice?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. And I think honestly, you you can't just continually just tell them that this is important.
Right.
I think at the end of the day, and this goes with any athlete or at any age group, is like you have to build relationships with the athletes and show them that you care about them
Right.
and you care about their success and their physical development. And at that point, once they know that you actually care about them and what you're doing, you'll probably get a little bit more buy-in from them. And once you get that buy-in, they're, especially younger athletes, are 100% going to see results. They'll
For
probably
sure.
see results really doing anything, to be honest.
Mhm.
So I think at the core of it is building relationships with the athletes that you're working with.
Yeah, no, I love that. There's always that, like, I heard that adage when I first started coaching that was like, athletes don't care how much you know till they know how much you care. And it didn't
Exactly.
make any sense to me until I actually started working with teams. And I'm like, oh, like if you don't give a shit about them, they're not buying into your session, no matter how much it's going to help them. Right. So no, I love that. You speak about movement optimization a lot on Instagram and within your book and stuff. I'm interested to know, from a hockey standpoint, what does movement optimization mean to you? Like, what do most players miss the mark on in terms of movement patterning and training in the gym, and kind of movement optimization to you as like, what are your priorities for every athlete that you see? Like, what's the top priority in terms of movement and just physical preparation to get them ready to play the sport of hockey?
Yeah, I mean, movement optimization in my mind means something probably different for everybody.
Okay.
Um, it's a really good question, and I think it is really highly individual. That being said, there's a lot of different things that these athletes all have in common,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we need to ask like some specific questions. So, like, can the athlete get into specific positions? So, do they have the joint mobility and range of motion to actually even just get in the position in the first place?
Right.
If they don't, then we need to figure out why that is and work on that. Do they have good lumbopelvic control? Can they actually control their body?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Layering on top of that, so they can get in a good position. Now, can they sustain that position when they're fatigued?
Right.
So it's like anything. Like, you can, if you get in a good position for hockey, but if you get fatigued within a minute or two, then it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
There's certain things that we need to. Can they extend and abduct their hips properly? What's their ankle mobility like? Right? These are all questions we need to ask, and I don't think it's you can just blanket statement every hockey player needs to improve ankle mobility or every hockey player needs to improve hip mobility. I think a lot of hockey players do need to do all that stuff, but I think you need to kind of assess the individual in each case.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that's kind of similar to what we do in that, everything should be an individualized approach. I think there's fundamental principles to the sport of hockey, and like you say, certain positions that need to be hit. But hitting those, or the restrictions in hitting those positions, are different for every athlete. Kind of transitions nicely into speed. I think the hockey is all about speed now. Seemingly, hockey's getting so much faster every day. The best players coming up in the national development programs are generally the fastest players. The sport itself is just getting faster. I'm always interested because hockey is such a strange sport in that you look at like field-based sports and court-based sports, and you can draw not necessarily a linear correlation, but you can draw a correlation to what I'm doing in the gym and how it kind of outputs on the field. Right now we're into NFL combine is coming up, so if you follow any of those guys on Instagram, they're all like trying to get 40 times better, right? And all of that is just purely drilling speed mechanics, sprint mechanics. And in something like a timed 40 track athletes, that stuff makes sense. In the terms of hockey, where it's like it's hard to quantify the carryover between like sprint mechanics and on ice acceleration and top speed, right? I'm interested to know kind of how you approach speed and kind of what that looks like within your system.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. Like, we're training athletes off the ice on a different surface using different patterns potentially than what they're doing on the ice. So how can you be sure what you're doing off the ice is improving on ice? I mean, there's certain things that we know, but I mean, I think it's a fairly complex question, and I think speed, honestly, like, I think we need to define really what we're talking about in terms of
Mm-hmm.
speed. So, are we talking about top end velocity? Are we talking about linear acceleration or change of direction, agility, or repeated sprint ability? Like, all those things they're a little bit different. They all kind of intermingle with one another. However, I think we need to really define what that means, and what we're looking at and what we're training. So I think the athlete needs to be able to be competent in all of those areas.
Right.
But again, we are going back to that individual. So some things I look at when I approach speed training is, does the athlete even have the energy system support to perform that, like your repeated sprint ability? You can get to point A to point B the fastest, but if you can only be the fastest one time, and then you don't have the energy system support for that, then it's, in this in the game context, then it's meaningless.
Right.
You see it all the time. So when when athlete in that case, like, we need to build energy system support. So does the athlete, we talked about this already, does the athlete have adequate mobility and range of motion to get in appropriate positions that are beneficial for force production and skating? Are they coordinated? Like, how well do they move? You've worked
Right.
with many young athletes yourself, and I see it here when we have young athletes coming into the gym that haven't trained much in the past, or haven't trained at all. They might be fine on the ice, but they come off the ice and they can barely do a linear march,
Mm-hmm.
or a skip. They just don't have really good body awareness. So that's another thing that I would, kind of look to working on with those athletes. Bottom line is, can they produce enough force, and can they do that rapidly?
Right.
So that's where your strength and power training comes into play. And I generally take the approach from speed training that I take this from, like, the Navy SEALs, where it's, their slogan is slow is smooth and
Right.
smooth is fast. So rather than, okay, right off the hop, we're going to do all these agility drills, run through these cones as fast as you can, blah, blah, blah. I take the slower approach. So I would typically, especially with younger athletes, break up my movement training into 4 days in a week, let's say in an off season. I might do 2 linear days and 2 multi-directional days. And those multi-directional days, I might divide into, let's say, like a lateral push or something, a lateral push. And then the other multi-directional day, I would do maybe crossover or drop step, something like that, depending on the day. And then slowly build up those qualities, movement skills slowly. And then as their competency increases, we start to add a little bit of complexity and velocity and just keep kind of layering on those components throughout an off season to the point where, by the end of the off season, there's no like distinct days. There's no linear day or lateral day or whatever, multi-directional day. It's just movement training. And we're incorporating all those different things into the same day, hopefully, if we can get the athlete there. But I think that would be my approach, is like, I take it slow. Let's make sure they understand, they can coordinate their body and how they move. Do they know how to decelerate? So rather than, okay, here's these cones, run through them, can you just run in a straight line and stop properly? Can you absorb those forces? And then you build and layer and do all those kind of things. So that would be my approach to speed training, movement training. And I look at them as almost the same thing. At the end of the day, my goal is to get these players faster.
Right. No, I love that approach. I had this conversation last week when we were talking about like kind of speed, and I do think there are definitely some carryovers to just doing max velocity sprints, right? I think there's some good nervous system adaptations you're getting from that. There's good like coordination benefits like you talked about. But in my mind, like top speed in hockey is like, to me, it's more about how you get there, right? I think the acceleration and getting in and out of positions is more important to me. You look at a player like Crosby. I always point to Crosby on my Instagram when I do like change of direction stuff, because he's so good on the wall at like stopping and starting, right? He gets in and he gets out of positions and he shakes guys really well, obviously because he's really good on his edges, but he's also really strong, and he's just be able to produce force and produce it at those really positive angles, right? And so for me, I think we spend a lot more time, I would say less, like we do spend a lot of time in the velocity end of that force velocity curve. But for me, when I think about speed training, it's a lot about more of those like heavy impulse, like heavy contacts, like more of those kind of what I would call hockey acceleration kind of contacts, of just like really putting those first 3 to 4 strides into the ice. I think that's what really separates the faster players from the less faster players, I guess, right? Once you get to top speed, it's there's a lot of the same things going on there, I think, personally.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you see it all the time. Like, so when a coach talks about speed, generally what they're referring to is the player's acceleration.
Right.
I've seen it many times, like in these, skills competitions or whatever. Like the teams will have their own little skills competitions at the NHL level, and the fastest skater around the ice where they're hitting top speeds is not the guy you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
But he's also not, sometimes it's a guy that has actually pretty high top speed, but isn't very good at accelerating. So once he gets there, it's fine. So if you're doing something like that, it's fine. But at the end of the day, that's not the game.
Right. Exactly. Right. It's like
you're rarely getting into that situation where you're hitting that top speed, unless you're McDavid and going end to end, or
and just
you're back checking against McDavid.
Even McDavid, that you get. I love watching McDavid's probably one of my favorite players in the NHL. Just watching him play, the sounds that guy's skates make with the ice, the strides and the chops he's putting into the ice are absolutely incredible. And it's like, from a strength coach perspective, I know like the average hockey fan that's watching isn't thinking about it, but every time I watch that guy skate, I'm just thinking of the power that he's able to produce, and I would love to see him in the weight room and just see what he puts out for numbers.
Oh yeah, like it's amazing to see him. I think a lot of it for him too is like his mechanics. Like he's just, you know, I'm not a power skating expert, but he looks pretty
Right.
flawless to me out there.
Yeah, no, he's a horse for sure. You mentioned briefly when you first started talking about speed, about conditioning. I had this question on my Instagram a couple weeks ago that someone asked me, like, what's the most important quality? What's the thing I look for the most in an elite level hockey player? And I think it was very easy to just say speed to that question because the game's so fast, and like we were talking about, fastest players are usually some of the better players on the ice. But to your point, my answer to that question was conditioning, because anybody can be the fastest player on the ice on the first shift. And I don't really care
Yeah.
if you're the fastest player on the ice on the first shift. It's the guy who can be the fastest in the last 2 minutes of the game that's going to help me win the game, right? So when it comes to conditioning throughout the year, even, what are you looking for? Obviously, hockey is a demanding sport in terms that it encompasses all the energy systems, right? Do you think there's anyone that you spend more time on or is more important? And how does that fluctuate throughout the season? Because I know for us, in season, our top line guys are spending a little less time doing conditioning because we're kind of letting the sport of hockey just take care of that a little bit. And our lower minute guys, we're supplementing with more like anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity stuff just to keep them in quote unquote hockey shape. So I'm interested to know if you spend more time in one energy area, or again, as I can assume, it's individual to the athlete. But I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it is individual to the athlete. I've seen so many different cases where, let's just say, you can, generally break up the energy systems into three, like aerobic, anaerobic, glycolytic, and then anaerobic, alactic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's rare, to be honest. I mean, particularly at the NHL level, this is where I have all my data. It's rare to be really good at all three.
Right.
Okay, so like generally the guys that are really good from an alactic and really good at anaerobic standpoint might not be as good from an aerobic standpoint, and vice versa. A lot of times the guys that are really good aerobically don't produce a ton of power from an alactic standpoint. That's not a blanket statement, because there's a few guys like Michael Backlund, guys I've worked with in the past, Michael Frolik, guys like that, like they're really good at all three. And
Right.
that's kind of like a unicorn. You don't see that very often. So I do think it like really depends on the individual, what you're working on. Now, like in season, like especially at the NHL level, you don't have a lot of time to be training energy systems. So you're hoping that the practices are structured in a way from the coaching staff, and you have a good relationship with the coach where you can help guide what those should look like, not tell the coach what to do, but say, if you're using something like Catapult or whatever, these are the workloads that you would like to see, or whatever it is you're looking at. So you're hoping that during the season, the on ice practice and games cover your bases, and that's not always the case. So like you said, if there's a guy that's consistently playing 5-7 minutes a night, you might look into doing some additional work. And you're right, I would probably in that case stick to more of the anaerobic side of things, just to kind of top them up, because that player, that if they're in the lineup every night and is only getting 5 to 10 minutes of ice time, they're not benefiting like the guys that are healthy scratch, that have extra conditioning at the end of the pregame skate, that are getting that on top of that. So those are really, in my mind, those are the guys you really need to focus on, and backup goalie as well, in season. So in season, yeah, I would primarily stick to the anaerobic side of things. Small doses, just to, obviously playing in games is priority. So you want to make sure that they don't accumulate too much fatigue in that sense. So don't overdo it.
Right.
And then in the off season, it's completely different. I mean, usually they're coming in after a significant layoff. Well, it depends if their team makes the playoffs or how much time they have in between. But sometimes guys haven't trained in a month or more, and haven't really done any aerobic work in a while, minus their hockey practices during the season. So usually in the first phase of an off season, I would focus on kind of aerobic capacity, aerobic power, and work capacity. So that could include aerobic base, which I don't do a ton of aerobic base. I maybe do that for a week or two.
Right.
Anaerobic threshold work and some VO2 max work. That first phase of that, that could be anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks long. And then those different, qualities and stuff vary as things go along. And also on top of that too, we have to remember that, the way I run things anyways is our movement sessions that I run with these guys. They're always, why are our warm-ups so long? Like it could be, 45 minutes plus. And I'm like, well, the first 10 to 15 minutes was your warm-up. Now we're training. So we're working on movement skills and do all that stuff. And like, if you look at their heart rates during that movement training, they're pretty much in zone 2 the whole time. The heart rate's 140 and whatnot. So after that initial phase of like aerobic work, I think you're still, getting doses of that daily in the movement sessions anyways. Phase 2, I would probably move on to like your anaerobic power and aerobic power. So, this is where I would start to introduce some like alactic stuff, focus a lot on lactate production. So how much, their ability to produce lactate, how efficiently can they produce lactate, and continue on with aerobic power. And then the last phase, kind of leading into training camp, working on, anaerobic power still and capacity. So that would include obviously the speed work, lactate production, and then you're adding in lactate capacity work. So how well can your body deal with like high lactate levels, buffering capacity, and things like that.
Yeah.
That in general, that's how I would structure it throughout the season. And in the off season, it's not set in stone by any stretch of the imagination. But,
Right. Yeah.
If I'm going on an athlete and I have zero data, if I'm not going to collect any bit of data, that's probably what I would do.
Yeah. I love that approach. It's the first time I've heard. Same thing with me. My warm-ups are notoriously long. If you want to call it a warm-up, like I said, like you said, the warm-up generally just bleeds into training, and it's hard to tell the difference because we're doing a lot of similar stuff in both of them, right? Our warm-ups don't look like come in, foam roll for 10 minutes and then do these activation drills. We're doing a lot of movement stuff. And I'd never thought about I've never tossed a heart rate monitor on any of the guys and seen what kind of zones they're in. But I've never thought that they're technically in that zone 2 realm anyways, right? And so, and it's interesting 100%. you bring up the zone 2 stuff, because I know like Tim, I don't know how to say his last name, Tim Lebrossois and Kevin Neal there in Boston. I know Tim is a big fan of like zone 2 stuff, and I'm always interested. You're a physiology guy, you have a master's in physiology, and I'm interested because I don't do a lot of distance zone 2 stuff with our guys, right? You talked about aerobic base building and how you only spend a little bit of time in that kind of area. We do a lot of like, not a lot of aerobic base, but all the aerobic base building stuff I do is interval stuff. So it's like minute on, minute off stuff, right? Just like you're working that, obviously you're working anaerobic, you're working all the energy systems whenever you do any conditioning, but we're primarily targeting that aerobic side because in my mind, and I'll bounce it back to you here to see if this makes any sense. But in my mind, going for a distance run, I don't need my guys to be able to do 5, 8, 10K runs at a zone 2 heart rate. I don't really think that's how hockey's played. And I think we're promoting that shift more towards oxidative type 1, slower kind of twitch fibers. So in my mind, interval training with those kind of aerobic intervals, minute on, minute off, or 4 on, 2 off kind of intervals, makes more sense because you're working that VO2 max into the spectrum. You're working in those zone 5, zone 4, zone 5 heart rates. And you're using that aerobic system to recover between sets. Does that make sense? Like the way I described that, or do you do any distance running with any of your guys?
Yeah, I mean, it does make sense. Listen, if you're doing like aerobic intervals or aerobic power intervals, it's obviously going to help your aerobic system. I think adding a little bit of like aerobic base work, and to preface this, I rarely get my players to run during this.
Okay.
And like I said, I'll only do this for like a week or two, really early in the off season, just for different things like blood volume and just kind of building up that base a little bit in terms of some of the physiology there. But also adding those components that you're talking about, like aerobic power work. So that's, your VO2 max, anaerobic threshold intervals. So like an anaerobic threshold interval, yeah, it's an interval, but it might be 6 to 8 minutes long at just above anaerobic threshold. I think those things are highly beneficial. And you're right. Like I would never spend a significant amount of time with my players doing long, slow distance running or cycling. If a guy wants to do that, go for bike rides on the weekend because that's his hobby and he really enjoys doing it, I'm not going to say no.
Right.
But I also don't think like doing that early on in the off season is really going to hinder, let's say power output or anything like that near the end of the off season. I actually think it will support it. Having a good aerobic capacity and aerobic base, there's not a lot of negatives to that when it comes to hockey. I always use this analogy, and honestly, like I for my athletes to try to keep it simple. And I don't even know if I made this up. I'm going to tell you right now that I made this up myself. But someone might call me on it.
Take credit. No one here to debate you, so take credit.
I'm pretty sure I made this up. But like, if you think of your energy systems as a car,
right?
The horsepower is equivalent to like your speed and your alactic capacity. Your size of your gas tank is like your work capacity, your anaerobic glycolytic system. And then your ability to refill the gas tank is that aerobic system. So in order for your car to work well, like all three of those things need to be at least pretty good. Like if you have a high-end horsepower, but you don't really have a gas tank, it's kind of useless.
Right.
Or if you have a huge gas tank, but you have no horsepower, it's also kind of useless. Or if you have high horsepower and a pretty big gas tank, but you can't refill the gas tank, it's not great. So like, I'm not saying you have to be elite in every single area.
Yeah.
But I do think that players need to be competent in each area for sure. And there's different ways to model it. Like no one's going to fit the same mold, but some guys get away with a little bit less horsepower, but they have a huge gas tank and a great aerobic system. They can just keep chugging along at that pretty good speed forever.
Yeah.
And I've seen it the opposite. Guys with great horsepower, fastest guys on the ice, and we talked about this already, where they are unbelievable for a couple shifts, and then they just fall off the map and disappear for the rest of the game, and maybe have a couple shifts at the end of the game where they're on again, but they have to be able to conserve energy because they don't really have a lot in the tank. So
For sure. No, I love that analogy. That's the first time I'm hearing of it, so we're gonna give you credit for it. That's a Van Asten special there.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's all
thank you.
yours. No, that's a great. I think that's a great nugget to take away for players that will listen to this. I think there's conditioning and hockey training in general can get so convoluted when you give it an analogy like that all these systems are supporting each other and one doesn't make sense with the other. I think that's a great takeaway for players and something that they can really grab onto and something practical. I want to transition a little bit into your NHL career. So you spent the previous 10 years with the Calgary Flames. Prior to that, you spent some time in what was quite literally the dynasty of the LA Kings in those 2 cups in 3 years back in 2013, 2014, or 2012, 2014. Obviously being a part of those teams, that being on those deep cup runs takes you well into the summer, right? Guys are getting banged up. That's a long season, right? On top of an already long 82 game season. So what does first of all, what does training look like throughout the playoffs with those guys, just to keep them healthy, allow you to go on those deep runs and keep the lineup the same night in, night out, keep guys off the training table? And what are you doing to support them on that deep of a run after that long of a season?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you're in the playoffs and you're going on a deep run and you've played, I think in those years, we played, if you include preseason games and all that stuff, played over 100 games for sure. I think it's more like 110 or more than that. It's a lot of hockey.
Yeah.
I think once you're in the playoffs and you're going on a deep run, you still provide training for the athletes. Obviously, you're doing really low doses. Like, you should be doing this anyways throughout the season, but you're microdosing small doses of different stimuli depending on the schedule and what they need. At the same time, like with the LA Kings, we had a fairly veteran team. It's one of the reasons why we were good, is they have a lot of autonomy in what they're doing. Like, you're not forcing anyone on that team to do anything. Fortunately, we had a really good training culture and guys bought in. It was great. And, like, guys were doing mostly what we wanted, but there was a give and take in terms of what we wanted them to do. And you offer that to them, especially in that scenario. I don't know what they're going through. Like, I can conceptualize what they're going through, but I can't feel it. I've never played 100 games in a season.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. I mean, there's like, it's certainly a big challenge in terms of, making sure that they're ready to play in those games where literally every game is, you're hanging by a thread and it's do or die. But I think the biggest thing is making sure that they're recovered, helping them the best way you can in that sense, and then providing a little bit of stimulus, depending on what you need, based on the schedule. But it's because you in the playoffs, like, you're playing. It's rare that you play back to back, but it does happen. You're playing 2 games, and you have your regular season games, and then you have your playoff games. And the deeper you go, the more intense it is, the more stress they have, like mental and psychological stress. There's all these different factors that come into play. So you have to, you take that into account. And you have to try to manage that and make sure they're, like I said, recovered, make sure their nutrition's really good, make sure they're doing everything right in terms of trying to get as much sleep as they can, because you play those 2 games at home and then you're on a plane the next
Yeah.
morning, or depending on where you are that night, to fly to the next place. Like there's not a lot of room for error, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and it's crazy at those elite levels because you not only have, like you say, the physical demands of what the sport is, but then, like you say, you get deeper. There's a difference between playoff hockey and regular season hockey, right? It's a little bit harder on the body once you get to the playoffs. So you have that load on the body, and then I didn't even think about, but it's a great point that you brought up about the stress of just getting to a Stanley Cup final. I personally, obviously, don't know what it's like to play in a Stanley Cup final. I can imagine night in, night out, it's pretty stressful. And so that's adding to that stress load, and
Yeah.
just inhibiting that recovery. Are you promoting anything in terms of recovery, like supporting them in terms of like giving them recovery modalities, or is it just more about, like you said, just sleep well, sleep as good as you can, get good nutrition in, and those sorts of things, take your mind off the game a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to take your mind off the game at that
Yeah.
point. But yeah, I mean, you focus on the big things, and it's a challenge. And it's not just playoffs, but to get sleep after a game for a lot of these guys, they're so amped up, and
Yeah.
their sympathetic nervous system's firing on all cylinders, and it's tough to fall asleep. So like it's it's that's a challenge during the season
Mhm.
with the travel and all that stuff, is to help them sleep. Nutrition is huge. But then, yeah, I mean, there's modalities, massage, you have
Yeah.
Norman Techs, cold tubs, hot
Right.
tubs, and all that kind of stuff. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of guys, it's a lot of the stress that you don't see. It is the psychological stress, and people, outsiders and fans are like, well, you make millions of dollars, like just suck it up and like be a player and like do your
Yeah.
job. And it's not that easy. They're human beings
Yeah.
just like we are, and a lot of them feel a lot of weight on their shoulders and to perform because of the situation they're in, and it's tough. Like, I remember the situation. This was my biggest concern at the time was in the 2012 playoffs with the Kings. Honestly, like, we were going into the Stanley Cup final and we had only lost 2 games
Yeah.
going into the final. And then we played New Jersey Devils in the final, and we went up 3-0 in that series right off the hop. Like, this is a cakewalk. We're going to win the cup,
Yeah.
like only lose two games. And then we lost the next 2 games. And game 5, yeah, we started on the road. Game 5 was back in New Jersey. We played a great game. We should have won. But this was vintage Martin Brodeur. He was the goalie, like,
Yeah.
stood on his head and was unbelievable. So we're going back to LA for game 6. And there was just this like crazy weight on everyone's shoulders. Like, you have to win that game.
Yeah.
You cannot lose this game, because you cannot go back to New Jersey, take another flight, and go back to New Jersey and like a do or die game after being up 3-0 in the series. And like, that psychological stress on those guys and us as staff, like, at that point, there's nothing we can do.
Right.
We're
Yeah.
just, we just have this stress load as well.
Yeah.
But one thing that made this team so good was the leadership within the dressing room. And it wasn't just the captains. Dustin Brown was a captain, Andrei Kopitar was assistant captain, Matt Green was another assistant captain, 3 veteran guys that,
Mhm.
are warriors. It was the supporting cast. We had 7 or 8 other guys in that team. If you put them on any other NHL team, they would have been a captain.
Yeah.
And I think it was the only player, and I could be wrong on this, but the only player on the team that had already won a Stanley Cup was Justin Williams. And he actually held, before that game, closed door meeting, players only. Obviously, I wasn't in the meeting, but I know the gist of, what he said to the group was, block out all distractions. We have an opportunity here to do something special. And believe it or not, this isn't going to be the same team next year. Guys' contracts expired, get traded, whatever. We need to do this now. And then the guys went out and we won the game 6-1.
Yeah.
But you needed that kind of leadership from guys that have been through it and been there and done that to get to that point. But that really just highlighted for me, like, at that point, it wasn't about physical preparation. Like New Jersey had been through more than we had been through at that point.
Yeah.
All teams are kind of like equal in terms of what they've gone through. It was more of a mental game than anything for our guys.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that takeaway, and that's I feel like we do sometimes in the world of strength and conditioning and preparation. We get too caught up in the preparation, the physical preparation. You forget about that mental component. But yeah, at a certain point to win a cup, it's grit, right? You just gotta be there mentally. Piggybacking off that a little bit. Obviously, being in those 3 years, you guys went decently deep. Obviously, won 2 cups. You went deep into those seasons, right? You're playing well into June, and so we know that that's a quick turnaround to get back into regular season, right? So with such a shortened off season, what does that look like for you in terms of like, what are your goals? What are you trying to prioritize in terms of just getting them ready, getting them healthy, even just to be back and to be playing for game 1 of the next season?
Yeah. So another challenge, which was a welcome challenge,
Right.
but a challenge all the same, was, okay, now season's over. We have basically 10 weeks to train before next season training camp. There's a lot of things that go into that. So you just played over 100 games. You have got a lot of guys that are banged up, need a rest, physical and mental rest. So you got to give them opportunity for that. You just won a Stanley Cup. You don't think these guys are partying all summer?
That's right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and they should, because they just won Stanley Cup. So
100%.
There's a couple of things that, throw a wrench into it. The one benefit, I always thought about was they're playing at the highest level you can possibly play all the way until mid-June.
Mm-hmm.
Playing in games. Their conditioning and their on-ice work is pretty good.
Yeah.
So we don't need to really focus on that too much in the off season. So we have 10 weeks to, build back up strength and power off the ice. And I kind of just broke it down in that kind of, we didn't really, we worked on energy systems and stuff, but it wasn't really the priority. They haven't detrained like the rest of the guys that stopped playing 2 months earlier have.
Yeah.
So that's still at a decent level. But, strength and power, primarily strength, but will probably decrease a little bit throughout the season. Hopefully you can maintain power to a degree. But, I looked at it as get them healthy, allow them to recover, do things that support that within the training, and then, get strength levels off the ice back up to where we need to be. And then, add on the little bits and pieces that you need to from an energy systems and that an on ice standpoint.
Yeah, no, I love that take of that. Like, in some ways you're at a disadvantage because the season's so short or the off season's so short. But in a lot of ways, like you said, you're at an advantage because you've been playing. Like, I always find it funny when people are like, what's the best way to build speed on the ice or conditioning on the ice? I'm like, well, get on the ice and skate. Like, the best way to condition for your sport is to play your sport. So like in some instances, like you said, you're more prepared because you've been playing the game at the highest level in the Stanley Cup playoffs for the last 2 months, while other teams have been golfing or drinking or whatever the guys are doing, right? So I love that take, exactly. And I love that. Yeah, no, that's a great take. I like that. I want to be super conscious of your time here, Ryan. So I'll leave you here with one question, and I apologize that I caught you a little off guard with this one. But so there's that adage of you're the average of the 5 people you hang around with the most, right? In kind of the digital age, I think that still holds true. And even you can kind of bring in you're the average of the 5 people you consume the most, podcasts you listen to, Instagram kind of people you follow, right? Every all the pieces of content you consume. So you're the average of those 5 people. I'm interested to know who those 5 people are for you, who've been your mentors in your career, in your personal life, you surround yourself with and kind of call your core group.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to list, and it's really hard for me to just narrow down 5. So I might spill over a little bit. I'm not sure.
Completely okay.
The first guy for me, his name was Anthony Slater.
Okay.
You might not know the name. He's not really in strength conditioning much anymore. However, he was one of the first interns ever at Athletes Performance, which is now Exos, and when it was a really, really small company out in Arizona, and ended up, getting hired by that company, and as one of their first employees, and kind of helped build that company from the ground up. Anthony was actually a teammate of mine at Queens for one season, and he was really my first mentor in strength conditioning, and he gave me the first program that I ever did when I was an athlete, like first real program that I followed front to back. Yeah. And like his support throughout the years has been exceptional, and he kind of went more onto the business side of things eventually, but initially he was the guy that really brought me into this world of strength conditioning, and really made me see how important it was as an athlete, and the fact that it could potentially even be a career. Because before that, we're talking in the early 2000s, I didn't know this was a job, that I can do this for a job. And I was always really interested in the field, and I loved helping myself and my friends and my family get better in terms of fitness, even though at the time, if I look back, I probably didn't know what I was talking about, but I was trying to help anyways, and I was really curious about the field. So he's the first guy. The second guy is a guy named Dave Frost. He's a professor at, I believe he's still at University of Toronto. He was a classmate of mine at Queens as well, and he was my first real training partner who by trade he was an engineer, and then I actually went into kinesiology after that, thinking he wanted to do sports biomechanics and all that kind of stuff. And he's the first one that actually taught me about mechanics and movement. And not only was he really good at that, he was like really big and strong and really pushed me when we trained together. Fast forward a number of years, when I moved to Calgary for my master's, meeting the group at CSI. So at the time it was Matt Jordan, Stu McMillan, Scott Ma, Jason Poole, all these guys that had, years and years of experience doing this. And just to be able to be around those guys and, learn from them and be a sponge from them, and eventually working with them alongside them once I started working at the CSI. I mean, those guys 100% have shaped who I am, the philosophies that I have. I still talk to a lot of those guys, particularly Matt, regularly. We're still in the same city, and I can call Matt up tomorrow and ask him a question, and it's just something I can do. And he's been a really
Right.
good support and resource for me. He has so much experience, particularly now, like when it comes to monitoring with force plates and different types of things like
Mhm.
that. Yeah, so Matt for sure. Another one I would say who I haven't been able to spend a lot of time with, or much at all, would be Mike Boyle out of Boston. And the reason I say Mike is because before I ever started doing this as a job, when I was doing my master's, I actually picked up. I was at the bookstore and I saw this book, Functional Training for Sports,
Yeah.
and I'm like, oh, this looks cool. So I bought the book and I started reading. I'm like, this stuff's really interesting and cool, and started implementing it. I was doing personal training and stuff at the time, and started implementing a lot of that stuff. And I was like, this is awesome. I love it. And like, in hindsight, I'm sure he would tell you himself, he would change a lot that's in the book. But at the time, it was, I thought it was amazing. And he's obviously had some updates to that book and everything. And now I, know Mike to a degree. And I
Mhm.
just think I really like his personality, and I really like his approach to training. And he's no nonsense, and he keeps it simple to a degree. And um, whether he knows it or not, he's certainly shaped who I am as a coach. And then the
Mhm.
last part is just a lot of the colleagues I've had, at the NHL level. I spent 12 years in the NHL. Um, every single one of those guys were unbelievable. You see them at the combine, and every time you play against the team, you chat and talk to them. A couple of guys in particular, like Matt Price, who actually ended up taking over for me
Yep.
in LA, who we worked together at the CSI prior to that. So we had that connection. He's been a big influence on me. And you mentioned Kevin Neild already. I talk to Kevin once in a while still, and those are some of the guys. And I'm missing tons probably, but
Right.
um, those are some of the few off the top of my head that I think have really influenced me and who I am. And kind of take what you learn from them, and you adapt it and you mold it. And eventually, like when I started out, I was just copying what Mike
Right.
Boyle was doing. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just copying. This looks cool. I'm
Yeah.
copying it. And then like
Yeah.
eventually,
Yeah.
as you get better and better and better, and you do it more and more and more, you start to develop your own techniques, and you start to see things a little bit differently, obviously, than everyone else. But that's definitely the starting point. The building blocks were there for sure.
Yeah. No, I love that. Those are that's a great list. Those are definitely some giants in the industry. And I think from my perspective, at least as a young coach, I can add you to a list of giants in the industry like that. So Ryan, I can't thank you enough for your time. You've been super gracious. You're an amazing resource within the hockey world. I really enjoyed this chat, and I can't thank you enough for coming on. For people that want to learn more kind of about what you're doing, where they can buy your book, or just more about you, where can we send them?
Yeah, I mean, I really only have one social media account um, that I've actually started to put some effort into since I've left the NHL for the first time. It's at Coach Van Asten on Instagram.
Yeah.
I do have a LinkedIn account, but I'm not really active on that. And if you want to check out my book, it's called Complete Conditioning for Hockey. You can either go to my Instagram account and click the link, and that will send you to my book and also X Factory website, or you can just go on Amazon. Amazon's probably the easiest place to find it,
Cool.
either in the States or Canada. It's available in both countries. So yeah.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah, and that's called Complete Conditioning for Hockey. I'll link all that in the show notes too. But yeah, Ryan, like I said, I can't thank you enough. It was a great chat. I really enjoyed this, and we'll have to get you on again sometime.
Yeah, me too. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem, man. I will stop the recording.